Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The dust of Ocotillo Valley was a cruel red curtain, choking the breath from the air and coating everything in a film of humiliation. It settled thick on the faded calico dresses of Tishomingo, Whispering Willow, and her younger sister Nalinko, Swift Runner, two Apache women who stood shackled by a short length of rusted chain. They were not being sold for a debt or for a crime, but simply for the perceived worthlessness of their blood in the eyes of the white men who now controlled the territory. The auction block was a rickety wagon bed in the center of a makeshift corral, surrounded by a dozen leering, sun-scorched men smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation. Tishomingo, barely 22, held her head high, her dark eyes, usually so full of the fire of the Sierra Madre, now holding only the cold, hard gleam of resistance. She could feel Nalinko, barely 16, trembling beside her, and with a silent iron will, she pressed her shoulder against the girl's, a physical promise that she would not break. This was the moment their world ended, not with a battle cry, but with the hollow thud of an auctioneer's gavel. The air was heavy with the silence of shame, a silence broken only by the coarse voice of Silas Kincaid, the man who had dragged them here from their hidden camp. Silas was a man whose soul was as ugly as the sun-blistered skin on his neck. He saw only profit, where Tishomingo saw an irreparable fracture in the soul of humanity, and he barked his opening line like a man selling used harness leather, referring to them in the most demeaning terms, ensuring that the men around them laughed and spat tobacco juice into the dust, completely erasing the dignity they held as daughters of the Chihan people. The bidding began, a sickening exchange of numbers that chipped away at their humanity with every dollar raised. The men offered livestock, parcels of worthless land, and coin, their eyes tracing the sisters' bodies with a possessive predatory hunger that made Tishomingo's stomach twist with nausea. She focused on a point just beyond the men, a distant shimmering heat haze above the mountains, and whispered an ancient prayer for strength into the dry air, a plea to Usan for a sudden, cleansing storm to sweep the filth away. She wouldn't meet their gaze, refusing to give them the power of her fear, but Nalinko, whose spirit was not yet tempered by the harsh betrayals of the world, let a single silver tear trace a path through the dust on her cheek. Tishomingo wanted to scream at the men, to unleash the savage fury of her people, but she knew an outburst would only invite harsher treatment, so she held the rage in her chest, a coiled snake waiting for the right moment to strike. Silas, sensing the crowd's rising excitement, slapped his hand onto Nalinko's shoulder, forcing her to turn, and began detailing her youth and strength, the casual brutality of the act drawing a collective groan of assent from the bidders, each sound a fresh spike in Tishomingo's heart. She knew then that if they were separated, their chance of survival, of escape, would vanish into the unforgiving landscape. Her primary mission was no longer survival, but cohesion. They had to leave this place together, no matter the cost. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell across the sun-drenched scene, and the noise of the crowd dropped instantly, a heavy blanket of quiet replacing the jeering excitement. A new figure had arrived, riding a tired but imposing sorrel horse. This man was different. He didn't look like the others. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, and his face was carved into stern lines by years of sun and silence. His attire clean, if worn, contrasting sharply with the ragged, greedy men around the auction block. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried, a long duster coat settling around his frame as he strode toward the wagon. His eyes, the color of distant mountain shale, swept over the scene, past Silas, past the leering bidders, and landed squarely on the two sisters. His gaze wasn't predatory. It was a slow, agonizing assessment, a gaze that seemed to weigh the full measure of their plight. He looked like a rancher, a lonely man who wrestled with the land, not with other people, a man whose silence was heavier than any shout. The auctioneer, flustered by the disruption, stammered a greeting, trying to draw the newcomer into the bidding frenzy that had momentarily stalled. The rancher remained silent, his hand resting lightly on the butt of a well-used Colt peacemaker holstered at his hip, a silent but unambiguous statement about the boundaries of his patience. The rancher, whose name was Elias Thorne, finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that cut through the silence like a sharp blade. "What's the final bid on the cattle?" The word cattle, spoken so casually, so devoid of emotion, was a fresh blow to Tishomingo, a reminder that in this context they were indeed viewed as property. Yet, his eyes held a peculiar, unsettling mixture of pity and resolve. Silas, smelling a higher price, puffed up his chest and named the current high bid, a sum of money and goods that was exorbitant for the territory, a boastful challenge in his tone. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't haggle. He reached into the inner pocket of his duster and pulled out a drawstring leather pouch, the weight of the contents clinking heavily against the fabric, and calmly dumped a pile of gold coins onto the wagon bed. They glittered in the harsh sunlight, double the price Silas had just named, a final, unarguable offer. The sight of the gold stunned the crowd into shocked disbelief. They had been outbid by a man who hadn't even haggled, a man who seemed to value these two lives more than any of them could comprehend. The silence was palpable, broken only by the clinking of the settling coins, a sound of bitter, instantaneous defeat for the rest of the bidders. Silas, momentarily speechless, scooped up the gold, his greed overcoming his suspicion. He quickly handed the rancher the papers of sale, his hands shaking slightly, and motioned for the man to take his purchase. Elias Thorne walked to the sisters, his spurs jingling softly, and without a word, took a key from his pocket. He knelt and unlocked the chain around Tishomingo's ankles, then Nalinko's, the metallic click of the tumbler sounding like a gunshot in the tense silence. The chain fell to the dust, a symbol of their broken servitude. Tishomingo watched him, her mind a whirl of confusion, her fierce suspicion battling with a sudden, faint spark of hope. Why the gold? Why the silence? He stood up, towering over them, and the three of them were completely surrounded by the bewildered, angry bidders. Elias looked past the men, back toward the mountains, and then his eyes returned to the sisters. His mountain shale eyes, still stern but now holding a flicker of something unreadable, something ancient and heavy, locked onto theirs. He spoke not to the crowd, but only to them, his voice a quiet promise that shattered the tense air and landed like a hammer blow on the emotions of the sisters, a final, stunning reveal that ripped the chapter open and demanded the viewer stay for the next beat. "I'll take you home." Elias Thorne's simple words, "I'll take you home," resonated through the dusty corral, an unbelievable sound that sliced through the bitter reality of their situation. Tishomingo, whose heart had been a fortress of suspicion for the last year, felt a dizzying disorientation. Home. The word was a ghost, a myth whispered in hushed tones around dying campfires, not a destination offered by a white man who had just bought her and her sister like sacks of grain. Her eyes narrowed, searching Elias's face for the trick, the deception that surely lay hidden beneath the generous offer. His expression remained utterly unreadable, a stone monument in the face of the sudden, hostile energy radiating from the defeated bidders. Nalinko, however, reacted with pure, raw instinct. The relief of the chain falling away, combined with the impossible promise, caused her to sway, her exhaustion suddenly overcoming the adrenaline of fear. Tishomingo quickly put a steadying arm around her sister, her eyes never leaving Elias, silently challenging him to explain his intentions. Silas Kincaid, the greedy auctioneer, had the audacity to call out, his voice sharp with the feeling of being cheated. "Now hold on, Thorne. That's a powerful fine price for a pair of good workers. You ain't taking them back to those heathen hills, are you? That was the deal. They stay property." Elias didn't even turn his head. the silent dismissal of the remark a more powerful rebuke than any shouted threat, cementing the sense that Silas and the other bidders were beneath his consideration. The moment stretched tight, pregnant with violence. The bidders, cheated out of their lustful prize, began to close in, grumbling and shuffling, their anger coalescing into a palpable threat against Elias. He remained perfectly still, a man completely comfortable with the proximity of danger, and his eyes, still fixed on the sisters, shifted toward his horse. "The horses are tied to the rail," he instructed, his voice low and firm, signaling that the time for discussion was over. "Get on the sorrel. She's strong. I'll walk beside you." Tishomingo hesitated, analyzing the scene. One man against 12, the sun sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in blood-red hues. She calculated the risk of trusting him against the certainty of the horror that awaited them if they stayed. Elias caught her gaze, and for the first time, a trace of something other than sternness, a hint of weary kindness, flickered in his expression, a quiet acknowledgement of the enormity of her decision. The choice was not between freedom and captivity, but between a known monster and an unknown phantom. She made her decision instantly, pushing Nalinko forward, urging her up onto the saddle of the sorrel, with a sudden rush of protective urgency, the horse's gentle nature a surprising contrast to the chaos surrounding them. Nalinko, weak and stunned, obeyed instantly, grasping the pommel, her eyes wide with unvoiced gratitude. As Nalinko settled on the horse, the crowd surged, the loudest of the bidders, a man named Jepson, lunging forward with a drunken shout, grabbing Tishomingo's arm with a vice-like grip. "You ain't going nowhere, squaw. You're mine. I had the highest bid before this. This idiot," he snarled, tightening his grip until Tishomingo felt her bones grind. The adrenaline of the past hour finally found its release in a surge of defensive rage. Before Jepson could finish his threat, Elias Thorne moved with the terrifying speed of a striking viper. Tishomingo saw only a blur of leather and steel. Elias's Colt Peacemaker cleared leather and slammed into the side of Jepson's head with a sickening, audible crack. The bidder dropped like a stone into the dust, his blood instantly dark against the red sand. The gunshot was absent, Elias choosing the brutal finality of the weapon's weight over the noisy declaration of a bullet, a move that spoke volumes about his deadly efficiency and his preference for silence. The remaining men froze instantly, their drunken bravado evaporating in the face of this sudden, calculated violence. Elias stepped over the unconscious man, his eyes sweeping the remaining bidders with a look so cold and lethal that they collectively took a step back, the air thick with unspoken surrender. His gaze lingered for a moment on Silas Kincaid, who wisely held his tongue, clutching the bag of gold with trembling hands. Tishomingo felt a shiver run down her spine. This man was not a savior, but a force of nature, dangerous and unpredictable, and his control of the situation was absolute. "Get on the horse, Tishomingo," Elias commanded softly, using her Apache name, a staggering shock that confirmed he knew exactly who they were and where they came from. He didn't offer a hand, recognizing that her dignity demanded she climb up herself, a subtle respect that deeply unsettled her. She mounted behind Nalinko, settling her body close to her sister, wrapping her arms around the girl protectively. Elias took the reins, leading the horse out of the corral and into the descending twilight. The angry whispers and threats of the bidders fade behind them, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of gravel and the heavy silence of their strange new protector. The journey began with the weight of that single powerful word, home, ringing in Tishomingo's ears, a word she no longer trusted but desperately needed to believe, her heart a tangled knot of fear and the nascent, terrifying hope that maybe, just maybe, this man was the unexpected answer to their silent prayers for rescue. As they rode away from the fading lights of the valley camp, the darkness gathered around them, a comforting cloak after the searing exposure of the auction block. Elias walked with a steady, indefatigable pace, his eyes constantly scanning the deepening shadows, a man completely attuned to the dangers of the open land. He didn't speak again, allowing the silence to settle between them, a silence that Tishomingo found both unsettling and surprisingly respectful. She could feel Nalinko's small, exhausted breaths against her chest, the girl having fallen into a deep sleep of relief and fatigue. Tishomingo watched Elias's broad back, the way his rifle was sheathed across the saddle, the economical movement of his stride, and she began to construct his story in her mind. A lonely rancher, yes, but one who knew the ways of the warrior, who moved with the quiet authority of a man who had seen too much and judged too little. The simple act of saying their names had revealed his hidden intent, confirming this was not a random act of charity, but a deliberate rescue rooted in some unknown history, a hidden connection that promised to be the central mystery of their terrifying new reality. She knew, with the cold certainty of instinct, that the journey home would be long, fraught, and that the greatest danger might not lie in the hills behind them, but in the secrets held by the man walking beside them, a profound silence that masked a deep, unrevealed motive for his staggering sacrifice. They rode through the night, the only sounds the soft, steady clip-clop of the sorrel's hooves and the sigh of the wind across the high desert scrub. Elias Thorne never slowed his pace, setting a relentless tempo that put immediate distance between them and the danger they had left behind. Tishomingo, wide-eyed and alert, watched the stars wheel overhead, a celestial map of their flight. She studied Elias from her perch on the horse, trying to reconcile the cold efficiency of the man who had bought them with the inexplicable kindness of the man who had spoken her Apache name. His knowledge of who they were, specifically identifying her as Tishomingo, was the hook that snagged her attention and refused to let go. Only a few people knew their traditional names, and those people were either long dead or scattered to the unforgiving winds of the reservation system. The question of how he knew her name, and why he cared enough to risk his life and fortune, became a pulsing, internal mystery that kept the terror at bay. She was an Apache woman, raised to read the slightest flicker of intent in a person's eyes, yet Elias Thorne was an unreadable landscape, his face a stoic mask that reflected only the distant, indifferent light of the moon. As the pre-dawn indigo began to bleed into the pale pink of sunrise, Elias finally paused, pulling the horse to a halt beneath the shadow of a massive, strided rock formation. He spoke for the first time since they had left the corral, his voice still low, but softer now, edged with the exhaustion of the long march. "We rest here until the sun is high. We're deep enough into the high country now that they won't follow the trail." He led the horse to a small, hidden pocket of shade where a sparse stand of juniper offered a little cover. He dismounted, and his first act was not to attend to himself, but to gently lift the sleeping Nalinko from the saddle. The care in his touch was a jarring contrast to the violence he had displayed hours earlier, a dichotomy that deepened Tishomingo's internal struggle. Nalinko stirred but did not wake, and Elias laid her carefully on a blanket he took from his saddle roll, covering her with a second one despite the cool morning air. Tishomingo slid down from the horse, her legs stiff and trembling, watching every single meticulous movement. She was starving, dehydrated, and her suspicion was a physical gnawing pain in her stomach, but she refused to acknowledge her needs until she had an answer. Elias unrolled a small sack of provisions, dried beef and hard biscuits, and offered them to Tishomingo. She took the food without eating, holding it tightly in her hand, her eyes unwavering. "Who are you, Pago? White man?" she asked, her voice raspy from disuse, the Apache word for white man carrying a natural defensive edge. "And how do you know my name?" The air became instantly charged with the weight of her direct question, the silence of the morning pressing down on them. Elias sat back on his heels, took a long drink from his canteen, and finally met her gaze. His shale-colored eyes, which had seemed so devoid of emotion, now held a deep, heavy reservoir of memory and quiet pain. He chewed slowly, seemingly gathering not just his strength, but his courage, preparing to dismantle the wall of secrecy he had maintained. Tishomingo noticed the subtle, tired slump of his shoulders, the weariness that went deeper than one night of riding, and recognized it as the mark of a man carrying a significant, unseen burden. He was old enough to be her father, his face etched with the story of a lifetime lived hard and alone in the vast emptiness of the West. "My name is Elias Thorne," he stated simply, his voice a steady level cadence. "And I know your name, Tishomingo, because I knew your mother, Cheyenne. I knew her 20 years ago, before I chose the life of a rancher, before you were born." The revelation hit Tishomingo with the force of a physical blow, staggering her backward a step. Her mother, Cheyenne, had died when Tishomingo was only 10, and her name had been a sacred, rarely spoken memory, a source of quiet strength. Elias Thorne, this dangerous, complex stranger, had known her? This was the "wait, what?" moment of the chapter, a stunning connection that instantly elevated the stakes from a simple rescue to a complex entanglement with the ghosts of the past. Her suspicion did not vanish, but it twisted, transforming into a desperate need for the full story, a yearning for details about the woman she barely remembered. She wanted to press him, demand proof, but the raw honesty in his eyes, the deep, abiding grief that suddenly broke through his stoicism, stopped her cold. He wasn't just claiming acquaintance, he was carrying a shared history. "Before I was a rancher, I was a scout for the army," Elias continued, his gaze drifting away to the distant peaks, his memory clearly unfolding in the landscape before them. A very young, very foolish man who didn't understand the true meaning of the land or the people who belonged to it. "I met Cheyenne when I was barely 20. She saved my life when I was wounded and left for dead by my own patrol during a skirmish far north of here. She found me, she healed me, and she taught me what it meant to respect this earth, to belong to it. The time we spent together was short, a single perfect season before duty and different worlds separated us forever. I left Tishomingo, and I promised her something I never kept, a promise to come back, to protect her if she ever needed it." He stopped, his eyes returning to her, heavy with the guilt of 2 decades. "When I heard, months ago, that 2 young Apache women were being held captive by Silas Kincaid, the name Cheyenne was the first thing I thought of. She had a daughter named Tishomingo. I did not buy you as cattle, Tishomingo," he finished, his voice trembling slightly with the weight of his confession. "I bought you to settle a 20-year debt of honor to a woman who once saved my life. Your mother's final request was that I ensure you and your sister always found your way home." Elias Thorne's confession, the story of his young recklessness, his debt to Cheyenne, and the 20-year-old promise to protect her daughters, hung in the clear morning air, a powerful current of revelation that momentarily eclipsed the hunger and fear Tishomingo had been feeling. The weight of his guilt was clear in the lines around his eyes, and the sheer effort of finally speaking the truth seemed to age him before her gaze. Tishomingo absorbed the narrative, her fierce distrust slowly giving way to a complicated mixture of awe and profound, aching sorrow. She finally understood the source of his profound, silent commitment, and realized that his act of purchasing them was not about them at all, but about laying the ghosts of his own past to rest. The gold had been a payment not to Silas Kincaid, but to the memory of Cheyenne. Yet, the story left a gaping hole. If he knew their mother, why the long silence? Why wait until they were literally on the auction block? She ate the hard biscuit he offered, its dry texture catching in her throat, the food only fueling her questions. "If you knew my mother, if you promised her protection," Tishomingo finally asked, her voice hushed but sharp with the pain of abandonment, "why did you wait so long? Where were you when the soldiers drove us out? Where were you when she died?" Her words were not an accusation, but a desperate plea for context, a need to understand the betrayal of time that had cost her family so much. Nalinko stirred at the sound of the voices, her eyes fluttering open, wide and confused, the memory of the auction instantly flooding her face with fresh fear. Elias knelt beside Nalinko, offering her a drink from the canteen before answering Tishomingo, a deliberate pause that heightened the tension. He met Tishomingo's gaze, not flinching from the justified anger in her eyes. "I was in my own kind of captivity," he admitted, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "The army moved me far north, into Montana territory, cutting me off from all communication. When I finally mustered out and came back south, 2 years after I promised Cheyenne I'd return, she was gone. Vanished. The whole camp was gone. I spent years searching Tishomingo. I thought they were safe on the reservation until I heard Kincaid bragging about selling a pair of wild squaws who spoke Chihenne. It was a terrible risk coming here, but I couldn't fail her again." Elias's genuine remorse was a heavy thing, an emotional currency that Tishomingo could not dismiss. She watched as he carefully checked the sisters for injuries, his touch respectful and brief, his eyes betraying a deep fatherly concern. He pointed toward a narrow, almost invisible trail winding up the sheer canyon wall beside them. "We can't stay on the flatlands. The sun will bring the riders. We follow that trail through the canyon of the Whispering Stones. It leads directly toward the high plateau country. If we can reach the plateau, we can find the old hidden route to your homeland. My ranch is far south of here. That was a lie to cover my intentions. I am taking you to your people, to the remnants of the Chihenne who remain free." This was the full reveal of his plan, not servitude, but a daring repatriation. The hidden intention, the secret thread she had been seeking, was exposed. Tishomingo felt a surge of empowerment. She was no longer a victim, but a participant in a perilous, high-stakes journey back to her roots. She nodded, a silent acceptance of the path and the man leading them. The climb was grueling, a relentless upward struggle that tested the limits of their exhausted bodies. Elias led them, sure-footed and silent, always watching their flanks and the high ridges above. The canyon of the Whispering Stones was a labyrinth of ancient towering rock, the wind carving mournful sounds from the crevices, echoing the sorrow in their hearts. Nalinko, though physically weak, showed a surprising reserve of mental fortitude, clinging to Tishomingo's hand, her fear slowly being replaced by tenacious determination. Tishomingo found herself watching Elias, the way his muscles bunched under the worn leather of his coat, the effortless way he handled the terrain, and she began to recognize the traits her mother had described in the few stories she shared of the young, honorable scout: strength, quiet discipline, and a deep-seated respect for the land he now helped them navigate. The sun rose higher, baking the red rock, and the heat became another physical enemy in their flight. They paused again near midday, huddled beneath a ledge that offered a sliver of shade. As Elias scouted ahead, Tishomingo noticed something on his left shoulder, half hidden beneath his coat. A small, intricate scar, faded but unmistakable. It was a distinctive star-shaped pattern that she instantly recognized from a story her mother had told her. A reminder of the time she had sewn up a young scout's terrible wound with bone needles and sinew thread. Her mother had called it the mark of the coyote. This silent physical confirmation of Elias's story, a powerful non-verbal clue, was the final piece of the puzzle that broke Tishomingo's absolute resistance. The man was telling the truth. The tears she had refused to shed at the auction, the tears of shame and rage, finally tracked down her dusty cheeks, now tears of gratitude and the realization of a profound, delayed justice. She knew the dangers ahead were immense, but she also knew that Elias Thorne, the lonely rancher who bought them, was bound by an unbreakable covenant to see them home. When Elias returned, she simply nodded, her eyes shining with newfound trust. "The canyon is clear," he reported, unaware of the internal shift the scar had caused. "We climb higher. The air gets thin up there, but so does the threat." The journey continued, their steps no longer the steps of slaves fleeing, but the purposeful march of people claiming their destiny, led by a quiet man haunted by the weight of a powerful 20-year-old promise. The ascent out of the canyon of the Whispering Stones was relentless, pushing Tishomingo and Nalinko to the brink of exhaustion. but their spirits were lifted by Elias's quiet confidence and the shared secret of his debt to their mother. As they emerged onto the vast, silent high plateau, the world opened up around them, a sweeping, wind-scoured landscape of ochre and purple rock that felt both immensely liberating and terrifyingly exposed. Elias immediately changed his gait, moving with the trained stealth of a scout, hugging the shadows of the rock formations, his eyes constantly sweeping the distant ridges. He explained to Tishomingo that, on the plateau, visibility meant danger. They were now within the hunting ground of the U.S. cavalry patrols, who policed the boundaries of the reservation, and any sign of movement could draw unwanted attention. The change in pace and the heightening of risk forced a tighter bond between the three of them, transforming their relationship from that of buyer and purchased to that of a survival unit. Nalinko, having recovered slightly, began to point out small, almost invisible game trails and water sources, drawing on the instinctive knowledge of the land she had learned from Tishomingo and their mother. Tishomingo, in turn, began to use her observational skills to study the terrain, anticipating Elias's movements, learning to match his pace and silence. They spoke less, communicating instead through subtle hand gestures and shared glances, the universal language of people under duress. During a brief rest stop near a dried-up creek bed, Elias carefully cleaned and oiled his colt. The mechanical sounds of the process a loud, jarring noise in the immense silence of the plateau. Tishomingo watched the methodical movements of his hands, recognizing that this was a man who lived by his discipline, a man whose quietness was a weapon. It was Tishomingo, however, who spotted the danger first. Her gaze was drawn to a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer far off on a high granite ridge to the southeast, a distance that most men would dismiss as the heat haze. But Tishomingo's eyes, trained since childhood to distinguish the unusual, saw a small, glinting reflection, the brief flash of metal. She immediately touched Elias's arm, a quick, sharp tap, and pointed, her expression grim. Elias followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing instantly. He raised his hand, signaling absolute silence, and pulled a set of small, brass field glasses from his pack. He held them steady for a long, tense moment, the only sound the faint, dry rustle of the wind. When he lowered the glasses, the stern lines of his face were deeply etched with alarm. "Cavalry scout," he confirmed, his voice barely a breath of air. "Too far off to see us clearly yet, but he's watching the canyon mouth. They know someone left the auction in a hurry, and they'll check the high ground." The appearance of the scout escalated the crisis instantaneously. They had gone from escaping petty criminals to evading the powerful, organized machine of the army, a force Elias knew intimately how to fight, but also how to respect. His calm demeanor never wavered, but his urgency became absolute. "We can't run across the open plateau," he whispered, scanning the horizon for cover. "The sorrel will be seen instantly." He made a split-second decision that carried immense risk. "We have to go down again. There's a geological fault line, a narrow fissure a mile east of here. It's barely visible from above, but it cuts right through this mesa. It's dangerous, rough going, but if we can reach it, the Ridge Scout won't see us until we're past his sight lines." The plan was a sharp, dramatic pattern break from their steady upward climb, shifting the scene into a desperate downhill dash for cover. They moved quickly and silently, Elias leading the horse at a forced march, Tishomingo and Nalinko running low to the ground, relying on their instinctive agility to navigate the uneven terrain. The sun was now high and merciless, beating down on the exposed plateau, and the exhaustion was starting to pull at Tishomingo's muscles with the intensity of ropes. She pushed the pain aside, focusing only on the rhythmic pump of her lungs and the side of Elias's broad back, trusting him implicitly to lead them to the fissure. Nalinko stumbled, catching herself quickly, and Tishomingo grabbed her sister's hand, pulling her forward, their connection a physical lifeline. They reached the edge of the fissure just as Elias heard the distinct faint sound of a distant, sharp whistle, the scout signaling he had likely spotted something, even if not them directly. The fissure was a terrifying sight. a deep shadow-choked crack in the earth, barely wide enough for the horse, descending sharply into the bedrock. This was the moment of no return. Elias looked at the sisters, his eyes holding the gravity of the choice. If we go in, we're committed. There's no turning back. Tishomingo didn't hesitate. She pushed Nalinko gently toward the precipice. We go, she affirmed, her voice steel-hard with resolve. Elias nodded, his hand resting once more on the butt of his Colt, and they disappeared into the deep, dark seam of the earth, leaving the exposed light and the watcher on the ridge behind them, a dramatic cliffhanger that sealed their commitment to the most dangerous phase of their journey. The descent into the geological fissure was like stepping into a subterranean world, a sharp, disorienting shift from the blinding light of the plateau. The air instantly cooled, thick with the smell of damp earth and ancient stone, and the silence was profound, broken only by the scraping of their boots against the rock and the low, nervous whicker of the sorrel. The fissure was treacherous, a vertical maze of slick, unstable rock, demanding every ounce of physical and mental concentration. Elias Thorne, now fully in his element, moved with a controlled precision that was breathtaking to watch. He used his immense strength and knowledge of climbing to secure the sorrel, carefully guiding the animal through choke points that seemed impossible. His patience with the exhausted horse a testament to his deep, quiet respect for life. Tishomingo and Nalinko followed close behind, relying on the Apache wisdom of placing their feet only where the stone was strongest. They were moving not just away from the scout, but deeper into a physical trap, where any wrong turn or dislodged rock could mean disaster. The darkness was the greatest obstacle, forcing Tishomingo to navigate by touch, placing her hand on the damp, cold wall of the fissure, letting her body find the rhythm of the descent. Nalinko began to falter, the prolonged fear and lack of rest catching up to her, her steps becoming erratic. Tishomingo pulled her close, anchoring her sister to her own body, whispering encouragement in Chiheni, their native tongue a private shield against the encroaching anxiety. The bond between them, the reason Elias had risked everything, was their greatest strength now, a palpable source of mutual power. The internal pressure escalated when Elias stopped dead, holding up a hand, his body immediately becoming rigid. Tishomingo halted instantly, her senses on high alert. The silence of the fissure was suddenly disrupted by a faint metallic clink from somewhere ahead and below, the unmistakable sound of a shod boot on loose scree. "Someone is already down here," Elias mouthed, his eyes grave. "Not a scout. They wouldn't be this deep in the earth." This was the surprise detail, the new twist. Their flight had intersected with another unseen threat. The fissure, meant to be their sanctuary, was now a corridor of confrontation. The tension coiled tight. They were trapped between the cavalry above and an unknown entity below. Elias unslung his rifle, the movement slow and deliberate, the sound of the metal scraping against the leather sheath amplifying in the tight space. He turned to Tishomingo, his eyes conveying a clear, urgent command. "Stay with Nalinko. Find the deepest recess you can and hide. Do not move or make a sound until I return, or until you hear my signal." 3 soft whistles. He didn't ask for permission. He relied on her instinct for survival. Tishomingo, recognizing the severity of the threat and the necessity of his action, simply nodded, pressing herself and Nalinko back into a shadowy alcove formed by a cluster of fallen boulders. The sisters watched as Elias melted into the darkness below, his formidable figure dissolving into the shadows as he descended toward the source of the noise, his long rifle held ready, leaving them suspended in a terrifying isolation. The time they waited felt like an eternity compressed into a few heartbeats. The silence returned, heavy and absolute, broken only by the quick, shallow gasps of Nalinko. Tishomingo wrapped her arms around her sister, her eyes fixed on the empty space where Elias had vanished, the silent love for her sister battling the fear for their protector. She felt the heavy, unforgiving silence of the earth pressing down on them, the fear of being abandoned in this subterranean tomb becoming almost unbearable. Then, a sound, sharp and muffled, echoed up the shaft. A violent, brief scuffle, followed by a grunt, and then the sickening, final thud of something heavy falling against stone. The sound was immediately followed by the terrifying, chilling sound of a single piercing cry of pain, abruptly cut short. Tisha Mingo's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew that sound was either Elias's victory or his last breath. Her hand instinctively sought the smooth, heavy river stone she had picked up earlier. She was alone now, and she prepared to fight, to protect Nalinko with the ferocity of the wild cat she was named after, knowing that in the darkness of the fissure, the true test of their survival had just begun. Tisha Mingo waited, frozen in the alcove, her ears straining in the absolute darkness for any sound that would indicate who had won the deadly, subterranean confrontation. The faint echoes of the struggle had ceased, leaving an oppressive, throbbing silence. Nalinko was trembling uncontrollably, burying her face into Tisha Mingo's shoulder, a silent plea for protection. Tisha Mingo held her sister tight, her fingers gripping the cold river stone she held, her mind racing through the options. Flight further into the depths of the fissure, or a desperate break for the surface. She knew, with chilling certainty, that the person who was moving now was the survivor, and they were ascending the shaft. The scrape, clip of slow, cautious footsteps began to rise from the blackness below, the rhythm too measured, too deliberate to be an escape, suggesting a hunter searching for prey. Just as the footsteps seemed close enough to reveal their owner, the three soft whistles cut through the silence. Whistle, whistle, whistle. Elias's signal. Tisha Mingo immediately relaxed her grip on Nalinko, the release of tension almost paralyzing, but her suspicion, honed by years of hardship, did not fully dissipate. A signal could be faked. She waited, watching the point in the darkness where the sounds had originated. Elias Thorne appeared, rising out of the deep shadows like a vengeful spectre, his silhouette massive against the faint light filtering from above. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exertion, but he was whole. There was a dark, wet patch on his left forearm, but the wound did not appear crippling. More alarmingly, his right hand still held the rifle, the barrel of which was smeared with something dark and slick. "Bandit," Elias rasped, his voice rough and low, confirming Tisha Mingo's intuition about the nature of the threat. He was hiding, waiting to ambush any travelers coming down the shaft. He had a rope and a knife. Elias was shaken, not by fear, but by the close proximity of the violence and the brutal necessity of his action. He walked toward them, moving with caution, his eyes constantly checking the dark corners. He didn't offer a detailed account. The blood on the stone and the grim set of his jaw were enough of an explanation. The emotional core of this scene was the realization of the full measure of Elias's protection. He was willing to kill to keep his promise to Cheyenne. Tisha Mingo looked at the blood on the rifle, then up at his exhausted, serious face, and the last vestiges of her distrust crumbled. This man was not a guardian angel. He was a flawed, violent, honorable man driven by a 20-year-old guilt. Elias briefly examined the cut on his arm, tearing a piece of cloth from his shirt to bind the shallow, bleeding wound. "We need to move quickly," he urged, his voice regaining its steady command. "The air currents carry sound far up here. If that bandit was working with others, they may come looking." The urgency was now absolute, fueled by the fresh, tangible evidence of their peril. They began to climb again, the final, desperate ascent out of the fissure. Tisha Mingo pushed Nalinko ahead, providing a physical boost when the girl's strength gave out, their ascent powered by the sheer, stubborn will to survive. Elias followed, his presence a heavy, comforting assurance of protection, his shadow a silent sentinel against the darkness. As they neared the top of the fissure, Tisha Mingo saw a sight that froze her blood. The opening ahead was not just light. It was filled with the clear, blinding light of midday, and etched against that light were three distinct, towering silhouettes. Three men, heavily armed, standing right at the mouth of the fissure, clearly waiting. They were not cavalry, they were rougher, dressed in the dusty, menacing attire of Silas Kincaid's men. Kincaid, having realized the value of the gold he paid out was worth less than the value of the sisters themselves, had obviously mobilized a search party, one that had managed to cut off their escape route. This was the moment of betrayal and the confrontation Tishomingo had feared since leaving the auction block, the escalation that brought the external and internal conflicts to a head. Elias saw them at the same instant. His body immediately tensed, the exhaustion dropping away, replaced by the coiled readiness of a predator. He shoved the two sisters back down the fissure shaft with a powerful, urgent movement. "Down! Get back! Hide!" he commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl. He dropped the sorrel's reins, drew his rifle to his shoulder, and took a single tactical step toward the opening, positioning himself as a shield between the men and the sisters. Tishomingo saw the steely resolve in his eyes, a look that conveyed his full readiness to die to fulfill his promise. He was not just protecting them, he was offering himself as the sacrifice. She grabbed Nalinko and pulled her into a small, dark crevice. Just as Elias began to shout, his voice echoing violently through the tight shaft, distracting the men above. The final sounds Tishomingo heard before the crack of the first rifle shot was Elias's powerful guttural cry, a mix of challenge and warning, and then the terrifying, deafening roar of the gun battle starting directly above their heads. The confined space of the fissure instantly became a deafening echo chamber of violence. The sound of rifle fire was immense, the reports reverberating off the canyon walls like the simultaneous explosion of many cannons. Dust, splintered rock, and the sharp, metallic smell of gunpowder rained down into the shaft. Tishomingo pulled Nalinko deeper into the crevice, shielding her sister from the falling debris, the adrenaline-fueled terror seizing her heart. She could hear Elias, his voice raw with effort, shouting commands and insults, punctuated by the rhythmic, steady crack of his own rifle, followed by the wet thuds of impacts. Elias was using the choke point of the fissure entrance to his advantage, forcing the men to expose themselves one by one, making his disciplined fire incredibly lethal. After a few excruciating moments, the opposing gunfire slackened, replaced by confused, panicked shouts from the men above, confirming Elias had inflicted damage. Tishomingo knew this temporary lull was their only chance. She risked a quick look up the shaft and saw Elias standing just below the lip of the fissure, his body braced, reloading his rifle with a speed born of years of practice. His back to them. He was wounded. A dark, widening patch of red stained his duster jacket high on the left side of his back, a much worse injury than the scratch on his arm. He had clearly taken a bullet intended for his heart. He was fighting on sheer stubborn will. "Go, Tishomingo!" Elias yelled down, his voice strained but powerful, his eyes fixed on the remaining men above. "There is a junction 20 feet below this. Take the left passage. It leads out to the eastern slope. Go!" Tishomingo stared at his wounded back, at the blood soaking the leather, and the choice before her was devastatingly clear. Escape, fulfilling the very objective he was dying for, or try to save him, which would risk all three of them and almost certainly lead to their recapture. The emotional tension was immense, abandonment for survival or mutual destruction for loyalty. Nalinko, having seen Elias's blood-soaked back, looked up at Tishomingo, her eyes wide with fear but also a new, painful understanding. Tishomingo grabbed her sister's hand and, with a silent, heavy oath of vengeance and protection, began to scramble down the fissure. They reached the junction Elias had described, a narrow, unmarked crevice that branched off to the left, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. They began the traverse, the path leading steeply downward and away from the battle above. As they moved, the noise of the gunfight faded, replaced by the terrible empty silence of their flight. Tishomingo, powered by a raw, cold grief, began to run, pulling Nalinko through the narrow passage, the memory of Elias's bleeding figure fueling her desperate pace. She felt a searing wave of guilt, the feeling of abandoning the only person who had treated them with honor. But she knew his sacrifice would be meaningless if she didn't survive. She had to ensure that his debt to her mother was finally paid in full, and that meant getting Nalinko home. The side passage proved to be a stroke of luck. It was an ancient, long-forgotten route, leading them away from the mesa and onto a slope covered in dense, stabilizing brush. They burst out onto the eastern slope, the afternoon sun a welcome but searing sight. Tishomingo stopped only long enough to check their location, her mind already calculating the distance to the Chiheni territory. Before she could move, Nalinko cried out, pointing back toward the mouth of the fissure, where the last sounds of the battle had been heard. Tishomingo looked up and saw the final, heartbreaking image that would be burned into her memory forever. Two figures emerging from the fissure mouth, not triumphant, but dragging the limp, heavy body of a third man. Kincaid's men had won, but not easily. They had retrieved Elias Thorne, either dead or gravely wounded, claiming their prize of a captured man. Tishomingo could see the dark, soaked stain on the ground where the men rested his body. This devastating visual confirmed the end of Elias's protection and solidified the transition from escape to a mission of vengeance and rescue. Tishomingo tightened her grip on Nalinko, her eyes blazing with a fierce, cold resolve. "He is not dead," she whispered in Chiheni, a vow that bound her soul. "We finish his promise, then we take him back." The sight of Elias Thorne's body being dragged by Kincaid's men ignited a fire in Tishomingo that burned away the last vestiges of fear and exhaustion. The internal battle was over. She was no longer running, but shifting into the role of a hunter. The immediate danger had forced Kincaid's men to retreat, but Tishomingo knew their destination would be Kincaid's home base, a sprawling fortified ranch that served as his criminal hub, located in a remote, heavily guarded canyon. Their final phase was not about reaching their people, but about a necessary detour for justice and rescue. The story had reached its highest emotional and physical tension, demanding a swift, decisive climax. Tishomingo and Nalinko followed the faint, broken trail left by the retreating men, keeping to the highest ground, using their innate knowledge of the terrain to remain invisible. Nalinko, transformed by the sight of Elias's sacrifice, moved with a quiet, adult determination, her childhood innocence replaced by a hardening resolve. She helped Tishomingo read the signs: a dropped canteen, a scuffed rock, the distinct tread mark of a heavy-booted white man. They moved faster than they should have been able to, powered by the collective memory of the shame of the auction block and the honor of the man who had bought them with the intent to free them. Tishomingo realized that in his brief time, Elias Thorne had given them more than freedom. He had given them their dignity back, and she would not allow his sacrifice to be in vain. As the sun set, painting the western sky in ominous shades of purple and burnt orange, they crested a ridge and saw Kincaid's ranch below. It was exactly as Tishomingo had imagined, a cluster of rough-hewn buildings surrounded by a high, defensive palisade, built into the mouth of a box canyon, making a frontal assault suicidal. She counted 5 men in the main yard and saw the distinct silhouette of Silas Kincaid himself, barking orders near a lean-to stable. And there, near the stable, lay a body, covered by a piece of canvas, clearly Elias. Kincaid had kept him not out of mercy, but likely to gloat over his captive or to use him as bait. This was the moment of explosion, the convergence of all the plot threads: justice for Elias, revenge for their dignity, and the final push for freedom. Tishomingo quickly formulated a plan, a strategy born from her people's warrior heritage. The fence was too high, the men too many. They needed a distraction, an internal weakness to exploit. She noticed the lean-to stable built against the canyon wall, a vulnerable spot. She instructed Nalinko to gather dry brush and wood, anything flammable, and pile it near the rear corner of the stable fence, ensuring they would have cover from the high winds. Tishomingo, meanwhile, used the fading light to scout the perimeter, finding a small, seldom-used water drainage ditch that ran beneath the main stockade wall, a route too small for a man, but just barely wide enough for Nalinko. When the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon and the men settled in for their evening meal inside the main house, Tishomingo gave Nalinko her final critical instructions. "You are the swift runner, Nalinko. You are the fastest. You will take the pouch of dried meat and you will go. You will go to the eastern slope and hide, and do not stop until you find our people. You are the future. I will get him." Nalinko, however, refused, her eyes wet but determined. "No, Tishomingo. We are sisters. We save him together. I will go through the ditch. I will light the fire, and when the chaos begins, you will go for the horses. I will be your eyes." Tishomingo looked into her sister's face and saw not a scared girl, but a resolute woman. The deep, unspoken love and shared trauma had forged an unbreakable partnership. Tishomingo nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the plan and the danger. Nalinko slipped into the drainage ditch, disappearing into the cold earth, her courage the sharpest weapon they possessed. Tishomingo moved silently to the main gate, her heart pounding a furious rhythm against her ribs, her mind preparing for the terrifying violence to come. She heard Nalinko's movement inside the compound, followed moments later by the faint, distinctive smell of dry brush and kerosene. Then, an explosion of light and sound erupted at the back of the stable, a sudden, blinding inferno that swallowed the night. The screams of the panicked horses mingled with the enraged shouts of Kincaid's men. The distraction was absolute. This was her moment. Tishomingo hefted the axe she had found near the gate and charged through the panicked chaos, heading straight for the lean-to stable and the unconscious body of Elias Thorne. The fire exploded, a roaring curtain of flame and smoke that sent Kincaid's men scrambling, their discipline dissolving into chaos. The plan had worked perfectly. Tishomingo moved with a focused intensity, using the distraction to her absolute advantage. She sprinted toward the stable, the heat of the fire a searing furnace on her back, the scent of burning wood masking the smell of blood. She found Elias's body exactly where she had seen it, lying near the stable wall, covered by a canvas tarp. She dropped to her knees, tearing the canvas away to confirm his condition. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, the wound on his back soaked, but he was alive. His pale, stern face, even in repose, held the silent promise of the debt he was trying to repay. Suddenly, a massive shadow fell over them. Silas Kincaid stood over her, his face contorted in a mask of rage and greed, illuminated by the hellish glow of the burning stable. He held a Winchester rifle, and the sight of the women he had sold standing over his captive ignited a final, savage fury in him. "You think you can steal my property, you wretched squaw?" he snarled, raising the rifle. "I paid gold for you, and I'll take that gold back out of your hide, starting with that fool who bought you." The final confrontation was here, the cartoon villain facing the empowered protagonist. Tishomingo didn't flinch. She had anticipated this. As Kincaid's attention was fixed on her, consumed by his rage and the loss of his stock, Nalinko emerged from the shadows like a phantom, having escaped the ditch and circled back. She was no longer the trembling girl. She was a sister seeking vengeance. With a swift, desperate movement, Nalinko threw a large, heavy water bucket she had seized from the pump, hitting Kincaid squarely in the face with a sickening, liquid thwack. The surprise attack staggered him, disorienting his aim. The shot went wide, burying itself harmlessly in the stable wall. That moment of hesitation was all Tishomingo needed. She lunged forward, not toward the rifle, but with the axe, aiming at the man's leg. The blade struck true, and Kincaid bellowed a primal scream, dropping his weapon and collapsing in agony, his reign of terror instantly and physically shattered. Other men started to converge on their position, drawn by the gunshot and Kincaid screaming. Tishomingo grabbed the abandoned rifle and fired 2 shots into the air. a loud, terrifying signal that momentarily scattered the disorganized bandits. She and Nalinko, working together, dragged Elias's heavy, inert body to the safety of the main stable doors, where Tishomingo quickly mounted one of the freed, panicked horses. She pulled Elias's limp form across the saddle, securing him to her with his own heavy belt. Nalinko mounted a second horse, and Tishomingo gave her one last fierce look of pride and affirmation. Ride. Do not look back. Ride for the high plateaus. They galloped out of the burning ranch yard, leaving Kincaid screaming in the dust and the whole valley illuminated by the furious cleansing light of the inferno they had ignited. They rode for 3 grueling days, Tishomingo navigating by the stars, caring for Elias's wound with the rudimentary skills her mother had taught her, using boiled creek water and torn strips of cloth, constantly checking for fever. Nalinko rode as her silent, tireless scout. Finally, on the dawn of the 4th day, they crested the last ridge and saw it, a tiny hidden valley, smoke rising from a few perfectly camouflaged dwellings, the unmistakable signs of the free Chiheni camp. They had reached their true home. As they rode into the small, welcoming clearing, the remaining members of Tishomingo's clan, her grandfather, Geronimo's brother's descendants, and a few dozen weary free souls rushed out to meet them. Their shock at the sight of the 2 missing sisters mingled with the deep suspicion of the unconscious white man tied to the saddle. Tishomingo dismounted, her body shaking with fatigue, but her eyes held the proud, fierce light of a true warrior. She addressed the elders, speaking in the low, emotional tone of her native tongue, recounting the betrayal, the shame of the auction, and the staggering, selfless, violence-tinged redemption bought by Elias Thorne. She told them of the 20-year debt, the scar on his shoulder, and the promise to Cheyenne. The elders listened in absolute silence, their faces unreadable. When Tishomingo was finished, her grandfather, a man whose face was a map of all the trials of their people, slowly walked to Elias's body. He looked down at the pale, wounded man, then back up at Tishomingo, his eyes filled with immense respect and a profound sorrow for the complex price of honor. "He did not buy you as cattle," the grandfather affirmed, his voice resonating across the quiet valley, echoing the title's core truth. "He paid the price of his own soul to bring you home. We will heal him." The sisters were home. Elias Thorne, the lonely rancher, was carried into the shelter, and as Tishomingo watched the clan doctors begin their work, she knew the journey was over. The circle was complete, the promise kept, and the bond between an Apache family and the white man who honored their mother was sealed forever in the high desert. A tale of justice, sacrifice, and the profound truth that home is always worth fighting for.